The question we want to ask is, what is a chaplain?
You know, that takes me a fair distance back during the World War II, when I had a great deal of trouble and needed a lot of help. I went to the chaplain, and I doubt whether I could have pulled through without his really dedicated help. As a matter of fact, I'm Jewish, and the chaplain who was available in our unit happened to be Catholic, yet that didn't make any difference. He was just incredibly helpful to me, as I mentioned.
What's a chaplain? I never knew one myself. I've seen him on TV.
A chaplain? Well, to me, a chaplain is someone that can straighten out the life of people who don't know how to straighten their own. For instance, I have a son who got himself into trouble. When he was 17, he left home, and I think if he'd have had the chaplain nearby enough that he would have straightened himself out.
What is a chaplain?
A chaplain? The only chaplain I know is Charlie Chaplain.
Todd, be serious. Chaplains, the word chaplain to me brings back sort of a nostalgic note. When I was a little girl, my father was in service, and a chaplain was the one who gave me my very first Bible, my very first one.
Do you know what a chaplain is?
He tells people what's wrong with them.
I suppose we should be asking, who is a chaplain? Because a chaplain is, first of all, a person. And in our church, some 666 persons are serving in the chaplaincy in all parts of the USA and across the world. All are ordained clergy, all specially selected, trained, and commissioned to perform a unique ministry. And our job is to shepherd them, help them to grow personally and professionally, and provide them with means of communication to bridge their diversity of ministries. What is a chaplain? A chaplain is John Barr, who is the Protestant counselor to the 900 patients at the McGuire Veterans Administration Hospital. What is a chaplain? A chaplain is Robert Blassingame with the 2nd Battalion, 12th Cavalry. A chaplain is Rodney Brown, employed by the Reynolds Company to work with their 12,000 employees. A chaplain is Reverend Peggy Ullman, who is a staff of one at the 400-bed Memorial Hospital of Worcester, Massachusetts. A chaplain is Roger Harmon, who counsels with youths sent by the Virginia courts to the Bon Air School for Girls and the Beaumont School for Boys. A chaplain is J. Harley Cecil, who ministers to the hundreds of children and adults at Murdoch Center for the Mentally Handicapped. A chaplain is Samuel Callier of the United States Air Force, stationed at RAF Upper Heyford in England. It was another Air Force chaplain, back in 1944, who made a deep impression on a young airman from a little Pennsylvania mining town. The airman's name was Wesley Aitken. When Airman Aitken returned to college, he shifted his major field of study from engineering to sociology and theology, then to Durham, North Carolina, and to Duke Divinity School.
I came down here to the Divinity School in 51, and then I didn't leave. I liked it. I just stayed on. After graduation in 56, I was invited to take the position at the hospital here as the first full-time chaplain on the staff, and I've been here ever since. When you ask the question, what is a chaplain? Perhaps the best way to answer it is to turn to the people whose lives have been touched in some way by a chaplain, such as Mrs. Jackie Cutrell. She was struggling through a great tragedy in her life, and she was under the treatment of one of our psychiatrists, and he asked for me to see her.
Medically speaking, the doctors had done all they could, but that wasn't enough. And after meeting Reverend Aitken, in essence, he taught me how to live rather than to exist. He has a profound understanding of human feeling. He takes away the negative feeling and makes you know there is something there. He believed in me and believed I could do it. He was able to get through to make me believe that I could do it.
I work with Evelyn Morgan, clinical specialist on our cancer unit. She and I are involved in the lives of people who are struggling deeply and many times tragically.
I deal with patients who are, in most instances, terminally ill, and when learning to cope with these patients help them cope with their own situation is many times almost impossible for us to do alone, especially if we've had these patients over a period of time and you get very close to them. And their illness, their downward trend, so to speak, gets very close to us and hurts us a great deal. And so this is where Chaplain Aitken comes in. I usually sit down and sort of help talk out my own feelings about this, because this is so important. If we cannot cope with our own feelings in dealing with this patient, then we cannot successfully help this patient through this.
I think in terms of Dr. and Mrs. Madison Spock, I've known them for several years, worked with Maddie a lot of times. And then their daughter had a very traumatic crisis in her life.
I think Wes really brought us to grips with the fact that there was no understanding of tragedy of this type that we were involved in as a family. And I think through Wes, he got us pretty well fortified for what was to come by pointing out that there was going to be no easy way out and that time would be required for healing so many of the problems that we face. Well, you can't think of tragedy as a blessing, but and yet I think he taught us more about religion in a few sessions than certainly we learned in a lifetime. And I think we developed a greater confidence of what would happen for our daughter.
I think of Earl Hare, parish minister. He called me at 10 o'clock the other night. He had arrived at Duke Medical Center with family from his parish, and they were in grave crisis.
This child had very suddenly become ill. The diagnosis was that he had a massive malignancy in his chest cavity, and it just meant the world to this family to know that a person with his competency, his ability, would be here to minister to them during this crisis situation. I certainly see him as a real ally in what I am trying to do in the parish, and I think it's a great loss to the parish minister when he doesn't effectively use the chaplain who has specific training in the area of crisis ministry.
That's a glimpse of who a chaplain is or what a chaplain is, but I continue to ponder over it. What are we in the business of doing? We're in the business of helping people live out a part of their lives when they're greatly troubled. When people are well, they tend to become more superficial and don't look quite so seriously at the deeper questions. But when they're troubled, no matter where, really, just troubled, that's a different matter. If a guy goes off to the military, for example, and he's separated from the people in his life that help him live it, that's quite an isolating experience. Or if he goes off because of having gotten into trouble somewhere, here's a person who's, again, being separated from people that are of any meaning to him, and he has to find a way to live with that experience. Or whether he comes into the hospital because of a health problem. When man finds himself in trouble, these deeper questions do become relevant. And my particular work, my specialty, is knowing the process of struggling with the questions and knowing that the answers can be achieved rather than my carrying around a bag of answers, handing them out along the way. I don't find it in life that the essence of the good life is comfort and tranquility. And I don't think that's in the gospel either. One of my favorite expressions is that, yes, the truth will make you free, but not necessarily more comfortable. And I think that is in the gospel. Of course, people come here into the hospital with a more traditional view of the minister. You know, it's far more preacher, far more the spokesman from the pulpit. That's their background, that's their heritage. And it wouldn't be out of the ordinary for the patient to say, "Glad you came, chaplain. What do you have to say to me today?" Like as if I might have a short sermonette or something. My reply could be, "I'm not sure that I have anything in particular to say to you right now, other than I hope that what's happening to you here is of some meaning to you and you're able to fit it all together." And then I might just say, how are things? And the patient might say, as part of her attempt to explain to herself, well, God's brought this to pass to teach me a lesson. Now, I probably wouldn't say, especially on a first visit, that the patient's explanation is different than mine. But after all, my primary concern is the way the patient is explaining what's happening to herself. She has to live with that, not with my ideas and my explanation. And she might go on to say, well, that's just the way I believe. And I'll say, if it has meaning for you, then hold to it. I know for myself a lot of times my ideas and my conclusions tend to change. If you ever find that you're thinking a little differently about what's happening here, and it would be helpful to have me to think out loud with you about it, say so. And if she were to say to me, for example, what do you believe about this? My answer could very well be, well, when I think about how you have explained it, it makes me curious in certain ways. For example, it's difficult for me to see God as someone who would say, I'll teach Mrs. Fields a lesson, so I'll zap her with an automobile accident. And I'd say, you know, when I think that way, it's awfully difficult for me to fit that together with my other ideas about God. Do you run across that kind of problem? It may sound as if I do a lot of the talking when I'm with a patient. Actually, my concern is that the bulk of the conversation is that of the patient thinking out loud. I teach my students this. For example, I say that it's good pastoral care as long as better than 50% of the conversation pertains to the life and the struggle of the patient. After all, if it gets the other way around, then the roles are reversed. The chaplain becomes the patient. But I do believe it's something of a two-way street. That's why I call it pastoral conversation more than pastoral counseling. Pastoral counseling is more of a formal process where the person comes into an office, sits down, and there's a specific kind of a contract that's arranged between the pastoral counselor and the counselee. We operate an outpatient pastoral counseling service here at Duke. These are people who have run into difficulties in their lives, well, like marriage and family counseling, problem-oriented counseling, alcoholism. We also have an outpatient adult psychiatric counseling service. There's a lot of referrals back and forth between the two services, but psychotherapy, to me, involves more of a pilgrimage back into the history of the life of the person, where there are blocks to a person achieving wholeness. It's more of a probe into the unconscious. Takes special psychiatric skills. Some pastoral counselors are trained in psychotherapy, but in general, when we think in terms of pastoral counseling, I would say that it's more at the level of managing an immediate life emergency or situation where a problem looms. When I talk about pastoral counseling, I'm talking about the process of loving, which is really the stuff that happens between people in the relationships. So for me, it's religious struggle. It's a religious pilgrimage. Even though for a lot of people, religion more traditionally is some of the rites and rituals and sacraments. You can't really have one without the other. By that I mean there's the process of living, and then man has to find a way to act it out and practice it. And so our hospital chapel is a vital part of our whole program here in the hospital. For people to struggle through painful, frightening, isolating, lonely kinds of experiences, they may be getting close to each other at the same time they're getting close to God. But that's the place. That's the focal point. But the primary mode of our ministry here in the hospital is pastoral conversation. I guess for no other reason than most of it's carried out right at the bedside with the patient. Administratively, I'm responsible for providing this service for the hospital. First to patients, then to family members, and then to staff, because, you know, staff grieve too. You know, the surgeon that is in the operating room, when he comes out of the operating room and has to go and talk with the family, he may have to seal off a lot of his feelings in order to communicate some tough medical facts and give the people some news. But he still hurts inside, and when he walks out, he may head back to his office and then sit at his desk and grieve. Or he might just call the chaplain, call me from the operating room, and say, come on and go with me. I've got some bad news I've got to tell some people. So it's not only patients, family members, but it's also staff. So administratively, I run that kind of program. I average fairly close to 10 hours a day, but by choice. That's me. That's where I hit my stride. And when I say hit my stride, what I'm talking about is I have to come to terms with who I am and where I am most fulfilled. All of this has to fit together. My schedule's such that I can keep my evenings free. During the day, I may be working on the relationships with my staff or my students or others. But that's the time when I'm working on the relationships with my family. We're great water enthusiasts. We have a second home on Carr Lake. Both the boys have grown up on it, and I sometimes call our lake home my tranquilizer. It's just an hour from here. We love to have people in and just let it all hang out. So we play hard together, we fight hard together. Our lifestyle is pretty much committed to the belief that you don't evade struggle. And I don't want to paint any rosy picture, but I'd say we're a pretty struggling but open, vital family. Ruth's a beautiful gal, no question. My relationship with her is the primary relationship in our lives. It provides the base of operations out of which we live and relate to all other people. Whether it was luck or intuition or what, we have grown tremendously throughout our married life, but we've worked at it, and our work has paid off. So that much of what I call the true church, when people get together and struggle to love and therein know themselves and each other and discover God. That I have found there with my family, but I have to find it other places too. And one place that's very dear to me is with my students. So when a student comes in and sits down with me, he knows that my interest in him is more in terms of how's everything fitting together for you? How are you finding meaning and value and comfort out of all this that's going on? We have a staff of from 10 to 15, have permanent staff of 4, and then a training staff of usually 10, 12. The trainees are persons who come here for clinical pastoral education. The basic 12-month unit is called an internship. The advanced 12-month students we call residents. I hold pretty firmly to the position that any chaplain on our staff, senior staff, who's involved in educating other persons in ministry must be involved in that pastoral care and counseling himself. I don't want anyone sitting in an office theorizing and trying to teach students. My guys here have to be specialists in grieving. That is, in helping people to adjust to significant loss or cope with significant loss. So that when a patient enters a hospital, it usually is a pretty scary experience. He loses his independence. He's forced to regress to a kind of infancy. You know, most of his care is taken over by other people, forced to be dependent. He loses his environment in which he maintained his identity. Back home he was a somebody. Then he comes into the hospital and he feels very much like a nobody. So I have to understand pretty thoroughly the grief process, because when I go in to see a patient the first time, he may be in the initial phase of that grief reaction, that shock with its accompanying denial. I remember the Sunday school superintendent from South Carolina that was here. He called for me, and initially he was all church. You know, "Chaplain, it's good to see you." And his whole effort was to say in some way to me, I'm really worth something. The way he did this was to talk about what he had been doing and who he was in that sense, but slowly ran down, you know. He just kept up with this kind of conversation for a while. And then I said, you know, I really appreciate hearing that about you. I respect your great investment in the church. But I notice you haven't mentioned anything about your reason for being here. And I have a feeling you called me more for that reason than any other. And then he broke down and wept. And he said, Chaplain, I'm scared. I'm so scared. I've got something wrong with my colon, and I'm pretty sure it's cancer. And it was. How he struggled. How he labored over the question, why? Why me? Why did this happen to me? Why? Why? What concerns me is that the institutional church tends to perpetuate the idea that would respond to this man in terms of have faith, keep a stiff upper lip. And this suggests seal off your pain and the fright and the agony. Seal it off and put on a front as if everything's all right. And then that would be in some way evidence of faith. But you know, it leaves out the whole dimension of, my God, why have you forsaken me? The whole dimension of agony over the question, why? Why does this happen to me? My response to him was, hurt, man. Go ahead and hurt. Let it out. It's okay. And it certainly is a rich part of the gospel, that God loves us when we hurt. I believe he found that. He was right in the midst of all of his pain and all of his anguish as he continued to struggle. Somehow there was comfort that accompanied it. And he was able to say, you know, my life's over. It's ended. And it really was. Within a year's time, he was dead. And in some way, I know what he lived through. To have lost, and then to find a way beyond that loss. I know myself, I've had to find out who I am, and I've had to find out who other people are. And I guess I have found a way to live with the fact that I'm a common, ordinary guy, that I hurt, that I know joy, I know excitement, but I also know pain. I know what it is to feel like somebody. I know what it is to feel like a nobody.
What is a chaplain? Perhaps a chaplain is a nobody. A prophet, a priest, a mortal being through whom God is able to touch the lives of fellow mortals. A nobody, an everybody.